This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Nuclear energy. From the 20th century, nuclear energy begins with the use of the atomic weapons in anger in 1945. Proceeding from that, however, is a rethink of nuclear energy. Atoms for Peace was the program that the Eisenhower administration brought forward. There was also the question of nuclear energy used for weapons of war, the Nautilus submarine. Both of these examples I have from a new book, Robert Zubrin's The Case for Nukes, How We Can Beat Global Warming and Create a Free, Open, and Magnificent Future. Nuclear energy has a cloud over it from the 20th century. It's not a radioactive cloud. It's a cloud of worry, of risk, of doubt by the general public in the United States and around the world after incidents in the 20th century very much introduced the question of, is it trustworthy? Is it safe? However, there's much more to say, and I welcome Robert Zubrin to comment on a poetic construction he offers early in his explication. To preserve the natural world, which is the goal of sustainable energy and of green technology and those concerned with climate change, to preserve the natural world, you must use artificial sources. Robert, a very good evening to you. I paraphrase you, so I ask you to explain your formula. Good evening to you.
Well, good evening to you, and thanks for inviting me on your show. I've always enjoyed it, and I'm very proud to be a guest on it myself now. Well, yes, if you want to do nature a favor, draw your resources from things that nature does not use, okay? Who saved the whales? Rockefeller saved the whales by creating the oil industry. The whales would have been hunted to extinction for their oil if we hadn't switched to petroleum, which is a resource that nature makes only very limited use of. The people who say we should get our energy the natural way by burning wood are causing the destruction of forests and the deaths of innumerable animals. Whereas nuclear energy comes from an element found in rocks, and a source of energy, namely the nuclear force in the atom, that nature does not use at all. All energy sources used by nature are chemical in nature in one way or another, not nuclear. So, want to save a tree, split an atom.
Let's speak of the advance to nuclear technology. You have some wonderful examples of how technology, which is cumulative, technology is cumulative. Advance from the year I begin with is the year 1 AD. The advance to the year 1500 AD, technology gained 17.5%. It accelerated from 1500 to 1800 AD at 58%. And today, well, it's not quite off the charts, but it's a long chart you'd have to keep. It's from 1800 to 2010. It's 4,700%. And I'm presuming that nuclear fuel technology is in that advance. So the record says we're going to go farther than we are now. However, the debate is nuclear energy versus fossil fuel. Does fossil fuel have enough energy for the prosperity of this planet indefinitely?
No, it doesn't. Now, fossil fuels have done a great thing for humanity, as wind in the form of sailing ships did before that. The reason why the rate of growth of human income, which is equivalent to technology, because the amount of goods the average person can receive is equal to the amount of goods the average person produces. And it is technology that multiplies the productive power of people. Okay. The wind with the long-distance sailing ship united the world so that inventions made anywhere, for example, in China, could reach Europe in a few years instead of centuries. And that accelerated the rate of growth. But by 1800, wind and solar in the form of wood, which is a form of solar energy, actually, were inadequate to power society. And this was a world with 1/7 the current population, and with a per capita income 1/50th of the current. Okay, that is the average per capita income in the world in today's dollars in 1800 was $200 a year, about 60 cents a day. That's the world described by Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo in their novels, people literally starving in Paris or London. Okay. Today, the average income in the world is $10,000 a year. In America, it's $50,000 a year, and we still have some poverty here. But the world average is 10,000, and half the world is below average. So actually, even though we've come a long way since 1800, the greatest problem in the world today is poverty. And if we were to try to lift the whole world to the current American standard of living, which still has flaws, okay, we would have to multiply world energy use 5 times. And if we take into account population growth and the fact that the more prosperous nations, America, Europe, Japan, are not going to stay where they are, probably 10 times. And we absolutely, well, first of all, the idea of powering the world with energy sources pre-fossil fuels that were not adequate to support a world with 1/7 the current population are certainly not going to be adequate to produce 7 times our current energy. And fossil fuels, while probably could just about do it, then the problems of emissions resulting from fossil fuels would become quite serious. So I am not in agreement that the world is burning up right now. It clearly is not. Okay. But if we were to increase our fossil fuel use 5 to 10 times, that would cause serious alterations in atmospheric chemistry. And that's an experiment we don't want to run. So
and water, wind, and solar, let's include those. Augmenting fossil fuel with so-called sustainables, is that adequate, Robert?
Absolutely not. They weren't even adequate in 1800. And they're certainly not adequate now. The kind of high energy, I mean, even late 19th century economy could not be propelled on wind and solar, let alone an early 21st century economy, let alone a 22nd century economy. And also, once again, these things make use of resources used by nature, notably, for example, land. Vast amounts of land are needed to generate energy using wind or solar. They also, the solar requires huge amounts of chemicals, and there is vast environmental destruction in China as a result of the solar panel creation industry, because you use fluorine compounds to create photovoltaic grade silicon out of sand, and they've caused massive fish kills, et cetera. Now, there's other renewable energies that are actually more reliable than wind or solar. That's hydroelectric. But I'm all for hydroelectric, but it's a limited resource. Most of the good river sites are already tapped out.
What is nuclear energy? Can we do 1934, 1949? These are important dates, making the point that this is within 100 years of technology. How does it work? Fission. Let's stay with fission. How does it simply work?
Well, the way it works is like this, is that if you take atomic nuclei, as they get bigger and bigger at a certain point, namely element number 92, uranium, they're as big as they can be and be stable, so that if you add a neutron to one, it breaks apart. And when it breaks apart into 2 medium-sized nuclei and also releases a few more neutrons. And if there's another uranium nearby that they can glom onto, then it will break apart and so forth, and you can have a chain reaction. Now, the fact of the matter is that the total mass of the fission fragments and the neutrons released in this breakup is slightly less than the mass of the uranium nuclei was in the first place. And that extra mass is converted into energy in accordance with Einstein's formula equals mc squared. And the amount of energy is gigantic, such that a given mass of uranium has 10 million times as much energy as an equivalent mass of oil.
It's that simple. What you're saying is not a complicated formula. It's that simple.
Well, I mean, everything, the basic idea is fairly simple. I mean, the execution requires certainly some skill.
Some engineering skill. Yes, of course, Robert.
Yes, it does. But just to give you an idea what this means, okay, the nuclear reactors get their fuel from uranium ore, where the uranium could be 2-3% of the rock. But even an ordinary piece of granite like you see buildings made of, like the mountains of New Hampshire are made of, okay, contains 2 parts per million uranium and 8 parts per million thorium, which can also be made fissile. And the amount of energy in those tiny fraction of the granite is equivalent to about 100 times the mass of the granite in oil. Okay, that is an ordinary rock. Okay, granite building, granite mountain, each kilogram of that has as much energy as 100 kilograms of oil. Okay, so we're surrounded by mountains of energy, provided we use our human inventiveness to extract it.
Let's talk about human inventiveness. The book is Robert Zubrin's The Case for Nukes: How We Can Beat Global Warming and Create a Free, Open, and Magnificent Future. Before we build it, let's talk about what can go wrong and why with nuclear energy in the 20th century. A nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island. Number 1 is shut down. Number 2 has an anomaly. What happened, Robert? Can you say it quickly?
Sure. 3 Mile Island had a meltdown. Okay. Now, the possibility of such an accident was known before 3 Mile Island. That is, you can turn off the chain reaction in a nuclear reactor instantly by dropping in the control rods or simply letting the coolant boil out, because without the coolant, the water, the neutrons cannot be slowed down enough to give them a good chance of causing another fission. So if the reactor gets too hot, the water goes away, fission is shut down. However, there are residual radioactive waste products in the nuclear fuel that are still decaying. So you shut down the reactor and instantly the power level goes from 100% to 7%. But then it only slowly decays from 7% down to 1% over the next several hours. And if you don't cool it during that period, that heat is enough to melt the fuel elements in the reactor. Now, the environmentalists said, oh, it's going to melt through the reactor, through the reactor pressure vessel, which is 8 inches of steel, and then through the containment building, which is 8 feet of reinforced concrete, and then through the Earth's crust all the way to the center of the world, and then somehow goes up the other side of the world and emerges in China. And
the China syndrome, 1979. That's what you're referring to.
That's right, the China syndrome. Now, in 3 Mile Island, there was an extraordinary reactor operator error that caused the coolant to be drained out of one of the 2 3 Mile Island reactors. And so the reactor instantly shut down the fission chain, but it still had the decay heat. And so the fuel did melt, but it did not melt through the pressure vessel. It melted about 1 inch through the 8-inch steel pressure vessel and stopped, let alone through the 8-foot containment building, let alone to China. Okay. And so 3 Mile Island is the only mega disaster in human history in which absolutely no one was hurt. There was a commercial loss. One of the reactors was lost as a commercial proposition, but there was no significant radiological release to the public or even to the reactor operators.
1986, Chernobyl. What happened? What went wrong?
Well, Chernobyl was a Soviet reactor, which is to say it was in a place where everything went wrong all the time. And the Chernobyl reactor had 2 problems with it that would have made it absolutely impossible to license in any civilized country. One is it didn't have a containment building, which is just ridiculous. And the second is it wasn't moderated by water. It was moderated by graphite, which does not evaporate if the reactor gets too hot. And so it didn't have the kind of negative feedback that a pressurized water reactor would have. And so the reactor operators pulled the rods, they caused the chain reaction to accelerate, and there was nothing to stop it, and it ran away. Now, it wasn't a bomb explosion, because for a bomb, you not only have to have a runaway chain reaction, you have to have it run away so fast that all the energy is released before the thing can disassemble and stop the reaction that way. In the case of Chernobyl, it ran away enough to blow the reactor open, about the strength of a small conventional bomb, and it blew the building open. And now you had hot graphite exposed to the Earth's atmosphere, so it caught fire. So that reactor was not only unstable, it was literally flammable. And about 50 to 100 firefighters got fatal radiological doses when they came to put the fire out with their hoses. There was some significant radiation released to the environment. If you use extremely conservative and I believe incorrect models, you would say that this amount of radiation released to the environment probably caused 4,000 cancers over the rest of time among the surrounding populations. However, it has to be said that, for instance, coal-fired power plants cause 4 million cancer deaths every year. You would literally have to have a Chernobyl, actually about 3 Chernobyls a day, in order to have the same amount of toxic exposure to the public as we're getting from the coal-fired power plants.
Let's go to 2011, Fukushima, the reactor on the coast of Japan following a seaquake with a tsunami overwhelming the plants and leading to a cascade of catastrophe. What happened? What went wrong? We have a couple.
Well, at Fukushima, we had an earthquake and a tsunami that was so destructive, it destroyed the entire city and killed 28,000 people, not from the reactor, but from falling buildings and drowning and similar direct causes of the earthquake and tsunami. And 3 of the 6 Fukushima reactors were wrecked. However, there was no radiological release of any significance to the public. So actually, the Fukushima is, if anything, proof of the safety of nuclear power, that you could have literally a gigantic disaster on a scale greater than most wars, and the reactors didn't contribute to the disaster in any way.
And finally, nuclear waste. It's been long part of the debate that nuclear waste is inherently dangerous. You identified 2 places to put nuclear waste. One is at the bottom of the sea. Another is in the desert. Why don't we use the sea, Robert?
Okay, well, okay, look. Sierra Club in the 60s, when nuclear power was really small potatoes, they used it as they supported it as a stalking horse for opposing coal and oil.
We have 30 seconds. Go ahead, Robert.
We have 30 minutes or seconds?
30 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay. Nuclear waste, the environmentalists tried to make disposal of nuclear waste impossible in order to create a problem for the nuclear industry. And the Sierra Club has said so, that is a tactic. In fact, there's plenty of ways to store nuclear waste. The Navy stores nuclear waste in salt caverns in New Mexico. It's just the civilian power plants that are prevented from having safe storage of their waste in order to create a problem for them. You know, if you outlawed parking, there'd be no way to park a car. Okay.
What can go wrong and why? Robert Zubrin, we're going to turn to what goes right, because there's a big case for nukes. That's the name of the book. Robert Zubrin is the author. Robert, you've addressed what can go wrong and why. Twice in the 20th century and once in the 21st century, nuclear plants were shaken by events. But at the same time, these events have not discouraged the building of new nuclear plants with new technology here in the 21st century. And you provide in your book a very careful list of where plants are under construction, when they're going to be completed, when they started. And I see the list is very extensive and ambitious, dominated by plants in China, although other parts of the world island, Eurasia, everywhere. However, what is striking is how few of these plants, in fact, I only count 2, are in the USA. What is the limitation of the richest country in the world about nuclear energy? Is it what we just talked about, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl? Or is it this other thing you produce, costs? Which is it, Robert?
It's hostile hyperregulation. The Carter administration was heavily infiltrated by anti-nuclear people, and they created a new regulatory structure for nuclear energy, which is so complex. I have a diagram of it in the book. It looks like the New York subway map. Okay, and actually it's more complicated than that, because each of those subway stops involves a whole subway map inside of it. And this has caused the time it takes a nuclear power plant to be built in the United States to grow from 3 years, which is how long it took to build the first one at Shippingport, to 16 years now. And as I show in the book, the cost of a nuclear power plant goes as its construction time squared. So if you multiply the time by a factor of 5, you increase the cost by a factor of 25. And it is that capital cost which is the primary cost of generating nuclear power. The cost of the fuel is only 5% the cost of the electricity. It's the construction cost that's everything here, 95% essentially. And or over 90, there's a few other costs. And that has been inflated by hostile regulation and other things that have made it very difficult to construct or even finance nuclear power plants. Like, for instance, the Governor Mario Cuomo, not the recent one, but the one we had in the 80s, stopped the opening of the Shoreham nuclear power plant after all the money had been spent to build it. It was set to go. That caused a $5 billion loss to the Long Island Lighting Company. And if you have government acting in such a capricious way, it becomes impossible to finance the construction of nuclear power plants, or else the interests in ensuring it against this sort of political risk becomes very costly. And that's what's happened. The United States invented nuclear power. We had the first critical reactor. We had the first bomb. We had the first nuclear submarine. We had the first commercial nuclear power plant. We had the first large commercial nuclear power plant. And yet, and in the early 70s, we were getting orders for 2 new large nuclear power plants in the United States every month. And if that had been allowed to continue, we would have completely decarbonized the American electric grid by the 1990s, as France basically did. But they were stopped. So all these people who talk about net zero in our electric grid are precisely the ones who are at fault for stopping us from already having decarbonized our electric grid. Okay, and greatly increasing the cost of electricity to American consumers and American industry, which has caused loss of jobs.
I'm presuming that this list, it's a very extensive list, are pressurized water reactors, which is the model that was from Shippingport, from the original reactor built on Atoms for Peace more than 60 years ago. However, you include entrepreneurship. There are other ways to build plants, and I want to go through this list and ask what this means. Are they under construction? Are they dreaming about them? There's water cooled. We've talked about that. But there's high temperature gas cooled. There's liquid metal cooled. There's molten salt cooled. Are those under experiment? Or are they in beta anywhere, Robert?
There is a number, and I list them in the book, of relatively small entrepreneurial companies that are pursuing these alternative designs for nuclear power plants. Now, look, I am not in agreement with people who say that the pressurized water reactor should be abandoned because it's obsolete, because they're just copies of Rickover's reactors from the 1950s. Actually, the pressurized water reactors have been very successful. There's been over 1,000 of them on land or sea over the past 60 years, and no one has harmed anyone. But that's not to say that they couldn't be improved on. Now, the hostile regulatory environment actually has deterred major companies from trying new designs because there are things you could do that could make the fuel much cheaper, but the fuel, for instance, breeder reactors, you could multiply the energy use of the fuel 100 times over with a breeder reactor. But the fuel right now is only 5% of the cost. The major cost is construction. And if you go to the regulators with a new design, they're going to be even more difficult to deal with than they are if you go with them with a design that they're familiar with. So the major companies have not really gone into this, but there are small entrepreneurial companies that are pursuing each of these alternatives. These include, as you mentioned, the liquid metal reactors are breeder reactors. They can get over 90% of the energy content out of the uranium instead of about 1%, which is what the pressurized water reactors get. There's thorium reactors, which can make use of thorium, which is 4 times as common as uranium. There's high temperature gas-cooled reactors, which are more efficient. They get about double the energy content. People are pursuing these. But unless we get rid of this hostile regulatory structure, they're going to be blocked. The Biden administration, I'll give Biden one cheer here. He has actually had the Department of Energy give medium-sized grants, $10, $20 million to a number of these small entrepreneurial companies to pursue their technology. But unless the regulatory structure is corrected, this will end in the research stage. It will never get to the consumer.
All right, this is a political question, but it's logical from what you just said. There are regulators in Brazil, there are regulators in Egypt, there are regulators in Turkey. Until recently, China was a trading partner. Now, I understand it's in doubt, but in any event, there are regulators in China. Certainly, there are regulators in the United Kingdom. Do these regulators all follow the procedures that are here in the United States? And if they do, Why are these plants under construction so ambitious?
Well, there's certainly regulators in those countries, and there's absolutely regulators in France. The France has a quite intricate bureaucracy, but it operates, and I could make some criticisms of their system, but compared to ours, it's the pure rationality. Because, look, let me give you an example of what's in our regulatory structure that's not, for instance, in the French regulatory structure. Okay. In our regulatory structure, you've got to go to the authorities and get your plan approved. Okay. But the authorities send it out to dozens of agencies, which all individually have to approve it. And for instance, one of those agencies is the Environmental Protection Agency, which will look not only at your plan, they will ask you to answer the following question. Why did you decide to build a nuclear power plant instead of something else? And you have to justify your decision to have built a nuclear power plant. Now, imagine you own some land in the mountains and you decide you want to build a log cabin on it. So you go to the mayor and you say, here's my plan for the log cabin. And you can see it's going to be a safe house. And the mayor asks you to prove not just that it's a safe house, but that it was the right decision to build a log cabin instead of an A-frame, a chalet, a Cape Cod, a candy store, a zoo, a guided missile silo. Okay, and somehow you managed to convince the mayor that it absolutely was correct to make this a log cabin and not a chalet or any of those other things. But then it's now open to the public to dispute the mayor's decision, and they can take you and the mayor to court to challenge his approval, okay, because they think it really should have been a chalet, okay, and then somehow you manage to convince the jury and the judge that you were right. They can then appeal it, okay. This is the nature of the process we have in the United States. It is pure insanity, and it was set up for the purpose of wrecking the nuclear industry. In France, there is a bureaucratic process, but it's set up for the purpose of making sure the plants are constructed safely and so forth, and various subsystems are present to deal with emergencies. You know, it's like this. We have regulation of airplanes. We have the FAA, but the FAA understands that its mission is to make it possible to run airlines safely, okay? It is not the FAA's mission to prevent the existence of airlines, okay? And if the FAA was run like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we would have no airlines.
Challenges. When we come back, challenges for the nuclear power business. Robert Zubrin is the author. The book is The Case for Nukes, How We Can Beat Global Warming and Create a Free, Open, and Magnificent Future. We're addressing the United States and what is to be done about the ambition to grow more energy resources without undercutting the environment in some fashion. And we come to news. Westinghouse Electric, the U.S. nuclear technology giant, is developing a compact version of its flagship power plant, a move aimed at making its designs more competitive in markets that don't need large conventional reactors. This is a report from Bloomberg News. Most recently, Robert, this looks like a way forward. Has Westinghouse found the magic formula in Washington, not only to build here, but to export small reactors?
Okay, well, they have found a potentially useful formula. Now, by the way, you should know right now the people dominating the nuclear reactor export market is Russia. I believe they're soon going to be overtaken and pushed out of that by China, which has bought a few Russian nuclear reactors, have copied them, and they're ready to go. Okay, so China's all business. They may support Russia more than the United States, but they're in it for the money. And China's building 450 nuclear power plants domestically between now and the year 2050, and they're going to be exporting them everywhere. But the Westinghouse used to export nuclear power plants. So what they've come up with here is a design for a medium-sized nuclear power plant, 300 megawatts instead of the standard 1,000 or 1,200, which has been the custom recently. And the idea is to go for new cities in the developing world, cities of 100, 200,000 people that are forming as countries in Africa, industrialize. The people leave the villages, they go to the cities, and the cities initially are of medium size. And they're too small for a 1,000 megawatt reactor, but maybe a 300 megawatt reactor. And furthermore, the Westinghouse design is modular. It can even be go down to like 100 megawatt. And so they can address these smaller markets. And also what they're going for is factory construction of the modules. That is to turn, if you do anything in a factory, you can do it much quicker than you can at a construction site. You do a weld at a factory, studies show it takes 1/8 the time it typically does at a construction site because you're set up, you're ready to go. So if all the serious work can be done in factories and the stuff can be shipped out to the site by trucks or at most barges, and then you just assemble it there, the whole thing can happen much quicker. Everything is standardized. It's like building airplanes, okay? I mean, it's something of some complexity, but they build airplanes in factories. They don't build them at the airport. And this is how they propose to make nuclear power plants. So I think this could put them in a position to be competitive. It could put them in a position to deal better with the regulatory structure in the United States if they have a standardized product that can just be assembled and everything has already been approved. But once again, the Chinese have a proverb: where there is a will to convict, evidence is never lacking. If the regulators want to stop you, they can. So ultimately, this is a decision. Okay, where there's a will, there's a way. Where there is not a will, there is not a way.
Let's go to outer space. Let's have some fun, Robert. Let's go to outer space. You've confirmed for me that Curiosity and Perseverance, the two spectacular rovers on the surface of Mars, both have nuclear energy power inside them. Is nuclear energy the genius that's going to get us a Mars colony and a moon colony? Are they thinking about that now?
Okay, space nuclear power is absolutely necessary to support the exploration and development of the solar system. Especially if we're talking about Mars and the outer solar system, the asteroid belt. At Mars, solar energy is only 40% as strong as the Earth. When you get to Jupiter, it's about 4% as strong. Saturn, 1% as strong. And the solar energy isn't really competitive with nuclear, even at Earth. Solar energy is useful for satellites and so forth. It's basically a nice off-grid power system. But for powering powerful Mars rovers like Perseverance and Curiosity, and certainly for powering a Mars base, or let alone a Mars city, we're going to have nuclear power. Nuclear power is absolutely key to the human future in space.
And because you've evidenced that their nuclear power is possible for rocketry as well, is that under development anywhere?
Not in a serious way. There have been certainly space nuclear power reactors, such as little ones on Perseverance and Curiosity. Right. And the Soviets used to use them a lot in orbiting radar satellites because the power of radar increases inversely with the fourth power of the distance. It really pays to fly a radar satellite low. But if you try to fly low, the solar panels would have too much drag in the atmosphere, so you can't do it. So space nuclear power has military uses as well. But in terms of space nuclear propulsion, there are studies. There's a small amount of R&D work going on at some NASA centers. And NASA also has an R&D program to address space nuclear power. And once again, the space nuclear propulsion is potentially useful. Space nuclear power on the surface of these other planets is essential.
Fusion power, we've bypassed it momentarily because it's still under development. Is it credible that we're going to achieve fusion power in the foreseeable future, Robert? We have 3 minutes.
Yes, and this is because there's a new crowd that are attacking the problem. We had a lot of progress in the fusion program in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, all progress was stopped because the progress was being driven by national competition between the Americans, Soviets, Europeans, and Japanese, all trying to outdo each other. But in the 80s, all the bureaucrats got together and they said, let's just have one program so we don't have to compete. It'd be a lot less stress. And so all progress from the government basically stopped. Because they all got together on this one giant program called ITER, which they took 30 years just to figure out where to put it. But now, as a result of the success of SpaceX, There people have said maybe entrepreneurship is the way to go. So it's not Musk, he's not into fusion, but people looked at his example and said, maybe the fundamental problem with fusion is the same problem with cheap space launch, which is that the wrong people are doing it. Maybe it's not technical, but institutional. So we got a whole bunch of fusion power startups all being funded, and they're looking at developing fusion on a 5-year timeline, not a 50-year timeline. And I discuss a lot of these startups in the book, The Case for Nukes. And I think we'll see one of them achieve ignition this decade.
Let's be rosy scenario, Robert, in our final minute. Right now, your case for nukes is extremely convincing. I see that China's listening. I see that Eurasia's listening. Germany stopped listening. The United States is hard of hearing. Is that going to change as we go into the facts of a sustainable future? Because solar's not going to do it, and the wind doesn't always blow. We have about a minute.
Well, Winston Churchill once said that Americans will always do the right thing once they have exhausted all the alternatives. Okay. And we're getting to the point now where we've exhausted the alternatives. And the Biden administration policy of attempting to reduce carbon emissions by making fuel and electricity more expensive, because that's what the policy is. Okay. This is a reactionary policy. It targets the poor because they're the ones who are most impacted by increases in fuel and electricity costs. And it costs jobs. It is wrecking our defense industrial base. And in the current world situation, which has become increasingly dangerous, we cannot afford to be a country without our own defense industrial base. We have to be able to build ships, which means we have to be able to make steel. And you can just go down it. We cannot afford this folly. This idea that we will strangle our own industry and buy everything from China is the destruction of America. And pretty soon, by the way, if we're not producing anything ourselves, they won't be willing to take our dollars. So we won't even be able to buy it from China. So things have got to be turned around. We're going to do the right thing. Okay, we will.
The Case for Nukes, How We Can Beat Global Warming and Create a Free, Open, and Magnificent Future. Robert Zubrin is the author. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.